Hi there, folks. Today's server-side chat is on the subject of comments. Before I get started, I want to point out our lovely background. My wife thought that it would be really much more memorable for you if each of these server-side chats had a different background to give you something to pin the topic on. And since today we're talking about comments, I figured old-style typewriter keys might be kind of fun. And yes, there will be at some point in the server-side chat, there will be the matrix background because all backgrounds must at least at one point have a matrix background. Anyway, for those of you who are of the TLDR category of person, the too long didn't read, let me summarize this server-side chat very, very quickly. You must put comments in your code. You must put comments in your code at least on every function and method, and generally speaking, at least for every block of code. That's the short form. The long form is why. Why are comments so important? What's the background of some of these things? Why is there some debate? That's what I'm going to talk about next. And so essentially the rest of this are going to be some stories. The bottom line with comments is the reason I'm insisting you put comments in your code is because it's necessary when maintaining large bodies of professional code. You know, with something as simple as a temperature conversion project, for example, you only have a few lines of code, and generally speaking, you can figure out what you're doing. You're also probably not going back and looking at the code later to understand what's in it. And you're going to write it, you're going to use it, you might reference it once or twice further on in your course, but that's probably it. But professional code lives for a long time. I'm going to give you an example. It's not C# code because I started actually the code for this thing before C# existed. Back in 1997, and we're talking 1997 when Facebook wasn't there, Twitter wasn't there, Google was just barely started. This was the beginning of the .com boom. I started a small internet publishing company that produced online journals. And the thing is that content management systems, blogging didn't exist yet. Content management systems where you'd actually go off and you know, put your articles in and have a whole structured system were very, 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 very expensive. We're talking in the, you know, multi-millions of dollars worth of expensive. And I was starting a small company. Blogging tools like WordPress and Blogger and things like that were just, they were far in the future. And so the other alternative was to hand code your own HTML, which meant that, you know, any one bracket could cause it all to go out of whack. And we were doing content daily. You know, I had people who were updating news on an hourly basis, and any one of those things could have knocked the code out. So anyway, the point is I had to write this thing. And I had to write this thing back in 1997. And I wrote it in a platform, an interactive development environment and publishing platform that at the time was pretty popular, but was a commercial product that stopped being supported somewhere around 2004, 2005. Meanwhile, you know, having written this stuff in 1997 and updated it constantly, adding new features, adding new functions, continuing to grow it, adding new capabilities, by 2007, you know, we're talking 10 years, we'd served billions of pages of internet pages to internet viewers. We'd published hundreds of thousands of articles, all in this content management system. Now, when I wrote this thing in 1997, I had no expectation that I would still be doing this stuff in 2007 or that I would want to archive the content. Today, I'm much less active in that business, but I still want to have all that content. We have hundreds of thousands of really good articles that I want to make sure that we can keep. But the problem is that, you know, there's no way in 2009 I was going to remember anything about what I wrote in 1997. And that's where comments became really useful. I also have what's called lab notes, and I set up a wiki. I didn't do it for the first version, and I sort of regret that, but once I realized that this was an ongoing project after about a year and a half into developing it, I started a wiki, and that wiki had basically history or lab notes for all the work I did. So as I added new features and as I added new functions and as I discovered something and as I learned how to do something new, I took notes on it so that I could go back, and in fact now I can go back to pages and pages and pages of lab notes which allow me to know what I worked on and how I worked on it and what my reasoning was and the various discoveries that were in there and so forth. So it's really important. Comments are important because, among other things, you may not remember what you wrote. I'll give you another example. This was from my thesis project. I was doing a language parser. And the language parser, there's a chunk of code in this thing. Now, this was written quite a long time ago, but there was a chunk of code that apparently I wrote at 4 or 5 in the morning in, a student-filled stupor of programming. And I have this block of code that basically says begin block of code and end block of code in the comments. And inside it says, this works, don't touch, I have no idea why it works. But meanwhile, at least I know that there's a chunk of code in there, or I knew back then that there was a chunk of code not to screw around with because it worked. The thing is as you're doing this, you're not always going to remember months, days, years later what happened in your code. So making sure you leave breadcrumbs, making sure you leave comments, your reasoning behind making a coding decision, the description of various variables and what they do, parameters for your functions and why those parameters work and how they work in concert with each other. All of those things become very, very important as you're putting this stuff together. Excuse me. Take a sip here. They become really important because you're looking for being able to maintain this stuff as you're moving forward in your code. Get rid of this again. So, what are we talking about here in terms of how you should think about this? Well, as I mentioned at the beginning, every function and method should have some comment. What's the purpose of the function? What does it do? What are the parameters? How are they derived? What are the choices that you're making? Most of your code should have at least comments in blocks of code. That is, for each logical segment, you should write some comment about why it's there, what it does, what your reasoning is. Whenever you put something in that you discover, like for example, if you figure out how to do something and why you do it, you should write some comments in there so you have it. You should also probably write some notes in Evernote or a wiki or something like that to help you keep track of what you've learned, the discoveries you've made as you're coding, or functions that you've discovered are useful, or resources that are helpful. Sometimes when I'm writing code, I'll actually put a web page link in as a comment if I found some good documentation online that describes how that chunk of code would work, and I'll put that in the code. It is a useful tool. Now comments are meant initially for you. That's the first point. As the programmer, as the programmer who initiates the code, comments are of primary value to you. But in a professional world, comments are also of value to those who must maintain the code after you. So if you get another job, if you move on to another role, if you become a manager, if you pass this code off to somebody else to maintain, the comments then become a roadmap for the person doing the maintenance on the code that you created. Now, there are a couple of schools of thought about comments, and I want to really dive into them for a moment. Some people don't believe in comments. Some people say that they can code without comments and they can read their code and it doesn't matter and it's a waste of time and why should they have to comment? That's all well and good. And you'll see a lot of open source projects that have no comments, and they seem to survive relatively well. But it's not professional. It's not something that is good practice or best practice, and I want you to learn best practice. Other people will say, well, if I don't comment my code, then I can't get fired because nobody will be able to figure out what I wrote. You might get fired for not commenting your code. But the point is that you shouldn't be doing this stuff defensively. You should be doing this stuff as a professional so that if you ever need a reference, or if you ever need to go back and support this stuff, or if they want to rehire you as a consultant at 4 times your rate to come back and do something, you know what your code is. But the idea of I'm going to obfuscate my work so that nobody else can maintain it, it's always going to reach out and bite you in the end. So I wouldn't advise that either. When I was in college, we had a grad student who decided that he was going to have some fun with comments. He was also a ancient studies major, so he spoke fluent Latin, and so he decided he was going to write all his comments in Latin. He also decided that he was going to put song verse in his comments, and to the complete annoyance of our professors. I've seen it. Don't do it. I will take points off if you go out of your way to try to annoy me. I've done that to my professors, and turnabout is not fair play. The point here is comments are useful. They're good for long-term maintenance. When you write the code, you may not expect to be using it, but you may later. And it's good for you when you're looking at the issue of being able to turn it over to others. Now, I'll give you one other little example. I mean, let's assume that you write this temperature conversion application. And now you're off in the professional world and you're doing something, and all of a sudden you need to do some temperature conversion. Well, you can go online to the web and look it up, or you may decide to go back through your class notes and find, all right, I wrote a temperature conversion code, let me pull that and use it. The point is, you never really know when pieces of code that you've written before are going to be used again. Good coding is reusable. The whole point of functions and methods and classes and object-oriented stuff is to make your code reusable, to have little Lego building blocks of code that you can build on top of other code. And the best way to make sure it's reusable is to know what the code does so you can use it. And that's why I expect to see comments in your code. Bottom line is, from a class requirement point of view, you must have comments in your code or you'll lose a couple points. From being a professional point of view, and frankly, from making sure it doesn't reach out and bite you sometime in the future, and best practices point of view, it's good to have comments in your code as well. So there you go, a server-side chat and comments. We'll have a different background for the next one, most likely. Have yourself a great coding day.